Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I am delighted to be with you today. We have a fantastic panel to talk about the pulse of the global economy in all corners of the world. So without further ado, let me welcome to the stage Peter Sands, the CEO at Standard Chartered, who is in really the sweet spot of the world, Asia, the Mideast, and Africa. Ricardo Salinas is Grupo Salinas chairman and founder. Of course, the Salinas Group, with exposure throughout Latin America, in particular Mexico, with interests in media, retail, financial services, telecom. Thank you, Ricardo, for joining us. Tony James is the president and COO of the Blackstone Group, the world's largest alternative asset manager. And Eric Schmidt is the executive chairman of Google, having led the company really from its throughout its formidable years, from a Silicon Valley startup to one of the leaders in global technology. Gentlemen, good to see you.
Hello, Maria.
Thanks so much for joining us. Given we are here at CGI, I want to kick it off with Peter and an announcement of a commitment that his firm has made in the face of all of this great stuff that we're hearing. Peter, what can you tell us?
Well, we've made a couple of commitments at this CGI, but the one I'd really like to highlight is one that is about really tomorrow's economy rather than today's. It's a program in which we use sport to provide life skills and increase the employability, economic empowerment of adolescent girls in urban slums across Asia and Africa. We've already put about 90,000 of these girls through this program, and what we're now doing is committing to scaling it up to 500,000 girls. And also, what we want to do is increase the impact by providing more access points into employability for these girls after they've been through the program. So apprenticeships, internships, work shadowing, jobs. The more we can do of that, the better, obviously. Now, we're doing it ourselves, but we're also looking for partners. And indeed, if there's any people in the audience who can help us there, because we're not going to be able to do ourselves 500,000 girls. So that's what the program is. And we see it as an investment in really tomorrow's economy, because these girls are going to be incredibly important both for themselves and for their households, for the economies in which they live and work.
You know, I think that it was Queen Rania who once said, when you help a girl, you help a family. When you help a girl and a family, you help a neighborhood. You help a neighborhood, you help a city, and it goes on and on. Why are girls so important to you?
Well, they are the key. They're the key to family livelihood. They're the key to the education of the next generation, because otherwise they get married too young, they have children too young. They're the key to public health issues. So they're absolutely at the core of resolving so many of the problems that poor urban dwellers suffer.
A great commitment. Round of applause for what you're doing at Standard Chartered. Thank you very much, Peter. Let's talk about the pulse of the global economy. Ricardo, I want to kick this off with you because this is really a good news story. Increasingly, when I speak with executives and managers of capital, they talk about Mexico.
Well, finally, thank goodness.
What is happening in Mexico that's attracting all this
close,
capital?
You know, we're closer than LA, probably. But yeah, Mexico is going through a good period right now. And we've had 12 years of very good financial stability, and now a new regime that comes in with full of hopes in terms of reforms. They put through two of them, are very important. One was a telecommunication reform, and the other one was the education reform. The telecoms didn't put up too much of a fight, not like the teachers, and those put up a big fight. And now the new one is energy sector reform, and we expect a lot of fireworks there.
And what do you mean? Why we're going to see fireworks?
Well, you know, the oil sector has been a monopoly of the federal government for years, since 1938 when it was nationalized. And so it provides 30% of the federal budget, and it's a very important piece of the action. So many people are in politics don't want that to be privatized, not for Mexicans and not for foreigners. So there's a very big political pushback. Now, the current government has been very clear on how they want to open, and I think it's a really good idea to open, especially deep sea drilling, where it's highly technical and very costly, and also this shale gas thing, which is not a priority for the oil company. It's new sectors that need to be open, and they certainly have the intention, but politics. Americans know a lot about politics too, so.
Yeah, they get in the way. So we're going to talk all about these issues, but let me get to each one of you real quick. Tony James, you've invested in the energy space around the world. Tell us where you see opportunity in terms of growth, and would you invest in an area, as Ricardo said so politically correct, where there is sort of this regulatory burden?
Well, energy is a great field because it's huge. And you both need a lot of new capital, but there's also a lot of secondary deals to be done, so companies to trade. And we've invested in energy all over. Now, energy broadly defined oil and gas, like what Ricardo was talking about, but also generation and power. And we've gone to some very strange places. So one of the really fun things we get to do is sometimes make investments that are wonderful investments, but transformational for the local populace. So we built a hydroelectric dam in Uganda. And a lot of people say, gee, you're putting $800 million in Uganda. Are you nuts? And it was really fun to figure that out. And we did it with the Aga Khan Foundation, which has a lot of clout locally because they're very important to the community. We hived off some sovereign wealth insurance some sovereign risk insurance for some parts of it. But bottom line, we got the thing built, and it doubles the power. That one dam doubles the power output of the entire country and lowers the cost per kilowatt for all citizens in Uganda 80%. Transformational for the country, lights, education, everything that flows from that. So that kind of thing is really fun, and we love that.
I love it, and I know we're going to talk a lot about Africa and a number of countries really leading the way there. Peter, I want to get your take in a moment on that. Eric, you and your company has been really among the most innovative in business today. 6 billion mobile phones on the planet versus 1 billion PCs or something like that. You can see where the growth is coming from. Where do you see growth, and how does mobility change the game for the world?
Well, for the next 10 years, the big story is going to be the rest of the world joining us with mobile devices, tablets, and phones, and they're going to be empowered. We take for granted that here we are at this wonderful conference with our phones, and we know everything, and we can follow everything. It's life-changing when one of these phones shows up to some of the people, the girls that you talked about that you're helping with your program, because it's safety, it's security, it's education, it's literature. For them, it's a very big deal, much bigger deal than even for us. So I think as we empower that, you're going to see huge productivity gains, huge learning gains, and ultimately huge innovation.
In terms of, so we've got energy and technology as a sector, as a game changer, and we've touched on a handful of hot spots around the world. Let's touch on Africa for a moment. Peter, what do you see happening, and why is this such an important part of your growth story at Standard Chartered?
Well, we have a very big presence in Africa. We're across 15 markets there. It's a very, very significant business for us.
Which countries? Go through some specifics.
Well, basically, most of sub-Saharan Africa we're present in. So our biggest business is actually in Nigeria. We are opening up in Angola and Mozambique this year, but we're pretty well across most of the other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Or at least a significant chunk of them. The point I'd like to pick up on both Tony and Eric's points, because I think they are particularly true of Africa. The mobile revolution has just been incredibly powerful in empowering people at every end of the social spectrum in Africa, in terms of particularly for food producers. It allows them to cut through the inefficiencies of the intermediary chain and find out where they can most effectively sell their produce. And it's been an extraordinary development, the mobile. Power, unfortunately, we're still, I mean, the Uganda story is a great story, but if you look at sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, there is a huge issue around both the availability of power, the resilience of power, and the cost of it. Most Africans pay a multiple of, say, what most Asians pay for power. And that's why actually President Obama's Power Africa initiative, I think, is sort of hitting the nail on the head, because it's focusing attention on a problem for Africa that is a huge enabler. If you don't get power right, it's very difficult to do a lot of other things.
Tony, your thoughts on this part of the world?
Well, we've found investing in Africa to be an exciting roller coaster ride in general. And it's a lot easier. The social merits of the investment are very seductive, but it's easy to get the money in, but getting the money out again can prove very, very challenging. And particularly if you're touching things that have, like what Ricardo's talking about, the energy industry or things like that, that have strategic importance.
And heavier regulation.
One of the good things of Mexico right now is that because it was a government monopoly, the whole energy sector, we have an official electric power company. And so that means that there's a unified grid. So as an independent power producer that we have on renewables, we're allowed in the private sector to invest in renewables. So we have wind power, solar power, and geothermal power. So it's very easy for us, once we go through all the bureaucracy, to inject the power into the national network. And they actually have a virtual bank of power. See? So if you don't sell it, you can always sort of put it in there and take it back. It's quite innovative.
But you mentioned
that's one of the things that you could do because it has a unified system.
You mentioned regulation. It's not so much the regulations. The regulations are often on the books and on their face they're okay. Yeah. It's the enforceability of them, and frankly, it's the after-the-fact changeability of them that are more the challenge.
You want to have specific rules in place, and you want to know those rules.
But the thing about power, you know, is it's great. Like if you say the cost of power is going to go down, but not by decree, I hope.
No.
And you get exposed to that kind of reaction from the governments because nobody likes to pay the bill.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the problems in talking about Africa, actually, and I think it's an issue in talking about emerging markets in general, is it's really, really easy to generalize. I mean, Africa is a vast place, and the cultures, the business environments across different bits of Africa are incredibly different from each other. There are some sort of common issues across the continent, but I think Africa is both a great term, but it's also a disadvantage if it means that people don't pay enough attention to the differences between the different countries.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned emerging markets, by the way, because emerging markets continues to be this sort of soft spot in the world. You're seeing outflows, and I know it's different in terms of
It's a weird kind of soft spot, though.
What is going on?
Well, a soft spot that is growing faster than the rest of the world is a sort of interesting definition of a soft spot.
But way down from the peak.
It has slowed down.
And with over 1 billion people in it.
I mean,
not small.
Emerging markets have slowed down, but there are a mixture of stories that are pretty challenging and some great stories like Mexico within it. So again, the sort of label of emerging markets, I think, is one that perhaps sort of conceals more than it illuminates. You know, obviously one of the biggest countries that has slowed down is China, but actually I'm not so fussed about that. I think China growing at 7% in a more sustainable fashion, with less environmental impact, with less overbuilding, is actually a better story for China and for the rest of the world than a China growing at a faster pace but in a less sustainable way.
And you do think it's 7%?
Oh, I think this year it'll certainly be. And actually, I'm pretty confident that the combination of the continuing urbanization and the next wave of reforms that I think we will see unveiled at the third plenum coming up in November, it'll keep it at or around there.
And yet, while we look around the world for these growth spots, and certainly you make a great point in terms of relative to the rest of the world, emerging markets are still showing real growth. In the U.S., we have this issue of unemployment. Eric, you've talked a bit about creating jobs in the U.S. What is the secret sauce?
Well, wouldn't it be nice if the government could just create jobs? Just sort of boom, just like that.
Yeah.
We'd love that.
Tried.
But that doesn't happen, right?
That one didn't work. So people have actually tried to figure this out. We actually have some answers. Turns out that big companies on a net basis don't create jobs. Now you say, well, little companies create jobs. Not true either. But little companies on a net basis don't create jobs. It looks like the only jobs that are created on a real growth basis are relatively new firms that are growing quickly. In other words, ones led by entrepreneurs. If you take a look, the situation is quite dire in the developed, mature world, right? Europe has essentially no growth. Japan, take a look, terrible situation. Huge urban youth unemployment, rural unemployment. Right? We don't quite know how to deal with this. Our political systems are failing these people. Where does the growth come from? It comes from technological progress. Now, we were just talking about energy. right? You have a huge new and very controversial, right, technological development that has really changed the energy picture in many parts of the world. It's a very, very big deal. That's because of technology, and by the way it was delivered is through entrepreneurs who worked with large incumbents.
Interesting.
Right? That's in fact how it worked. The same is obviously true in my industry. So my analysis of this is that these issues are going to continue, but everyone ends up in this state of everything's locked together, right? Because the political systems basically lock. The only thing that changes that is either a dictator, which is clearly the non-correct way to do this, right? Right, or in other words, not a democracy, or a commitment to entrepreneurship, and you need to unleash that. Examples would be, you need to let immigrants come into the country. Shocking. You've got to actually have venture capital or other kinds of investment for them so they can create businesses. Many of these emerging markets that you're describing are run by a small number of families who are also interconnected with the political system, right? And then you also have the corruption issue, which you guys mentioned in various forms. So that's, I think, how we really solve this. It's time for us to figure out where real growth comes from in our societies and do it. If we don't, we're going to end up like Greece with people in riots, and that's not a good thing.
The extraordinary thing about entrepreneurship, to my mind, is that so much of it is about getting rid of the impediments. People in most societies, if you give them the opportunity, they will be entrepreneurs. I mean, one of the things we've discovered with this gold program for adolescent girls, you don't have to give people much of a platform before they start saying, actually, I can sell some fruit, or I can.
By the way, it's shocking that people are curious, creative, and have their own energies and their own passions.
Yeah.
It was like amazing fact to me that the majority of the world was like that. They're just like us.
Exactly.
What a shock.
It's
Okay.
Well,
And by the way, look at the Chinese history of entrepreneurialism. You don't think that the Chinese government is the one making this happen. It's the fact that the Chinese people have had thousands of years of small-scale entrepreneurs and very, very clever people who are very aggressive.
I
You know,
love
that's
it.
exactly the problem we have in Mexico, as you were saying, Peter. Part of our efforts in the banking, we have a bank for the bottom of the pyramid, and so we do banking for the unbanked. We have now 30 million customers. Of those, we have 1 million customers who are women working in groups, and they all do their own business now. So this is the microcredit model. So we have these seminars with these women, and it's inevitable. The first question is, how do I get the government off my back?
yeah.
Yep.
Because the first thing, before I sell anything, I have to go and get registered to pay taxes, and then I need the municipal food sales permit, and then I need the retention taxes for all the employees. It's just problems, problems, problems. Number one problem is government.
Yeah.
And by the way, in many of these countries, what's happened is that the power structure has managed to make it work pretty well for them. The reason these countries are stuck the way they are is because the people who are powerful have no incentive to change. The way they will change is that an emerging middle class will put pressure on them. They'll say this corruption is not appropriate, we need new entrants. In other words, the pressure will come from within these societies, and people say, look, it's the crisis of rising expectations. If you take a look at Europe, Europe has managed to actually sort of lock itself into a structure where it's very, very difficult to do these new things. It's very difficult to change these regulations.
Partly because of labor laws.
Well, for many reasons, right? Regulatory structures, multiple levels of government that disagree, and so forth and so on. You've got to come up with some kind of balance. You've got to let the entrepreneurs have the freedom to innovate and keep them from sort of, for example, destroying the environment at the same time. It's a very hard balance, very hard to find.
The other commitment we're making at this year's CGI plays into this, actually, because we're making a commitment about increasing our lending to SMEs to about $30 billion. So it's an increase of about 10% every year over the next 5 years. But more than that, also, we want to be providing training in things like cash flow management and accounting to the SMEs, because SMEs, entrepreneurs...
Small and mid-cap enterprise.
Yeah. Entrepreneurs are... Some are going to succeed, some are going to fail, and some are going to succeed. Some are going to fail because their idea didn't work, but some are going to fail for bad reasons, because they didn't understand the basics of cash flow management. They didn't understand the basics of just running the finances of their companies. Now, if we can help them with that basic skill set, we improve the chances of their success. And in, most societies, whether rich or poor, SMEs, entrepreneurs, that's where the new jobs are going to come from.
So are you seeing this across the world? I mean, I know we're seeing this in the U.S., a huge wave of entrepreneurialism. But I think some of that has been the result of pressure. After the 2008 financial crisis, people, opted to go start their own businesses rather than try to get a job in financial services or some of the other areas. Is that what we're seeing?
It's not a new phenomenon in America. One of the geniuses of the American system is that this has been true for many, many years. And we have very, very strong research universities. And I think other countries are beginning to discover this. You still have the petrostates that are sort of organized around a specific sort of mineral good. Many of the emerging countries had the property that much of their growth came from minerals, mineral booms, mining booms, those sorts of things. That you have to transition to a knowledge economy. Right? And in a knowledge economy, you have to favor the talents of underrepresented groups like women. You have to focus on education. You have to have free flow of ideas. You have to have everybody interconnected. One of the great things about the technological revolution, and by the way, emerging markets, typical example is 10 to 15% of the GDP is the telecom. Right? It's the most profitable legal industry in many of these countries is telecommunications. It gives you a sense of how powerful communications is and how powerful these platforms are. Eventually, these devices can be used to track corruption, ensure the safety of women, enforce this education, and deliver the goods through the banking, for example, the online banking that you're doing in Nigeria as an example. All of that is sort of fundamental to the rising tide.
And Ricardo, are you seeing that in Mexico? You mentioned the women and the program that you have been implementing in Mexico, but what else is happening in terms of young people starting businesses? Is this taking fire?
Mexico is a young country. You have about 120 million people there, and they're very young. And they're not going to sit around on their hands, waiting for the government or anybody else to fix their lives. They're taking action in their own hands, and there's a tremendous vitality. Now, it cannot be underestimated the pressure to keep them in place by all these regulations and things. I would take issue there with Eric in that the powerful families are part of that. No, those are also victims of the system. The governmental control system is highly centralized, and this is something that comes to Mexicans from way back. We inherited the centralism of the Aztecs, and we inherited the centralism of the Spanish, and then we made a fusion and made it even more centralized. So this is why the Zócalo and the Tlatoani, this is very central structure.
You can't underestimate the negativity of a government that's corrupt and bureaucratic. We have 19 companies in India, and it's a nightmare dealing with that government. Everything has to be approved, and it's strangling the economy, in my opinion. And you've got to, maybe you'll get the upwelling of the middle class as for that, but boy, when you get a society that's complex like that with entrenched almost tribalism and caste and whatnot, it doesn't cut across those lines very well like it does in the United States, and it becomes very, very hard to change. And our biggest barrier in a lot of these countries to sponsoring growth is the government itself.
I'm glad you mentioned India. I've been trying to figure out why it is that while we're all talking about the BRIC countries as well as beyond just Brazil, Russia, India, and China, that India seems to be left behind in some conversations.
India's growing at about 5% a year. It has been growing at about that rate for the last decade. And despite the horrific governmental structure, 200 different tribes, 28 major languages, 6 dominant languages, and the disorganization that everyone sees, they've continued to grow. A lot of it, I think, has to do with the dependency ratio, where they have a lot of young people. It's also true in Mexico. Young people are part of the solution, not the problem. Right? They get power. And I think that's exactly what you were trying to say earlier.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I think India has some great strengths. It has great demographics, and actually, at least a proportion of the population gets pretty good education. And the entrepreneurial culture is very effective and embedded. But it is absolutely the case that the sort of governmental side of things has a capacity for strangling, and maybe that's building on the British legacy of bureaucracy.
It also has to do with the problem that governments are expected to do certain things, like build infrastructure. And if you have a disunified government or a poor government or just a corrupt government, the infrastructure doesn't get built. So whenever you have a technological innovation that allows you to bypass that infrastructure, you do great. So for example, the wireless adoption of 4G is another statement that the government couldn't run the poles and the wires along for 50 years. They're literally skipping that.
So things are going well away from government.
So to the degree, to the degree that you can invent technologies that enable small businesses or large businesses to do it themselves, right, and solve the problem, you'll get it much faster.
And get the government approval to do that.
Well, and the government needs to.
That's
the government at least
take the rail system in India. It employs 1 million people. They're not empowering new technology and new companies to come in to go around
the rail system.
One other thing that we should not underestimate is the educational system. In many of these emerging markets, especially in my country, the government is the entrepreneur for the education system. See, it's the owner.
I think that was I think that was not a non-syllogism.
I know.
And
I know.
The government is the entrepreneur.
So imagine they're supposed to be, you know, they own the education system. So they pay the teachers. They set up the curriculum, and they control every aspect of the school.
So is that good?
It's terrible.
Yeah.
It's terrible.
So
and that's why it's going right to the heart of the problem. What is the problem in Mexico?
Right.
We have huge amounts of people.
We have some of those problems here.
Well, it's funny. I was thinking.
By the way, the American rail system was invented by private companies.
So should the private sector be taking more on in terms of education then?
Listen, don't you think that one of the most transcendent industries or entrepreneurial initiatives would be educate 40 million people? Should be, right? So why is that in the hands of a centralized federal bureaucracy?
I mean, in some ways, the recipe, I think, is relatively simple to articulate. If you have a dynamic and flexible education system that gives people the skills to be able to take advantage of opportunities, and you provide an environment, a regulatory environment in which infrastructure is built so that people can get their goods to market, they can communicate with each other, that they can get power. And then, as far as possible, you want to stand out of the way. And sort of let them get on with it.
What about security? I mean, you all have to operate in some of these areas of the world that you are seeing the drug trade, the security still an issue. Go to Brazil with bodyguards. I mean, how do you balance this?
I think what's interesting as a tourist going to these countries is to see how humans adapt to stuff that would be completely inconceivable in America. And depending on which city and so forth, you end up seeing an awful lot of high walls and an awful lot of security guards. But the fact of the matter is humans survive in these systems and they get used to it. The most interesting stories are the people who manage to get through war, right, and manage to build businesses. Think about the Lebanese as an example, or the Afghanis right now. So people are remarkably resilient, and this entrepreneurial spirit that we're talking about survives. People solve the problem. They figure out a way to get their kid to school. When Jared and I were working on our book, we went to Libya, and we found that the Google Maps stuff was being used by schoolgirls to plot where the NATO bombings were going so they could get to school.
Unbelievable.
I thought, oh my God, what a school lesson.
Yeah.
But I do think a fundamental public good that governments provide, if they provide it well, is basic physical security.
Basic security.
And
it's something you need
if they
government.
can't do that, I'm not sure we're going to invest there anyway. I mean, that's such a basic need that if that's not there, it speaks other problems.
Ricardo, what do you say on that?
Well, I guess I'm the expert on that.
Yes, yeah. Yes, you are.
I live right there. So yes, bodyguards are needed and security is needed, and we adapt, like Eric was saying. But I have to say two things. First, we, the media, are very good at pointing out all these disasters. I was going to Turkey this summer, and many people said, no, don't go, there's going to be a problem. Well, I was in the south of Turkey, I didn't see anything. It's kind of like that. No, don't go to Mexico. Mexico is a big place.
It's a problem of math, right?
Mexico is a big place. So there might be a demonstration in Mexico City, and there's nothing going on in Cabos or in Cancun, right?
So there's
but now we wrote off the whole country.
And now
there's a bombing in a country of 100 million people, and that bombing is in a city that you're not going to. You're clearly at huge danger, right? That's the logic, and that's essentially TV inspired.
Right. Understood.
And so,
in fact, it's interesting that in Mexico, they've had this horrific problems with the drug gangs.
Yeah.
And yet, here's a country that's doing so very well now. Talk about human resilience.
And that's a very interesting point. Many people don't understand when you see these deaths and things, it's 100% between those people, that are in that business. By the way, sponsored by the United States, by the Prohibitionist Initiative, that in this country they discovered prohibition and then they took it away and then they put it back for drugs. but only certain drugs, not alcohol and tobacco. No, that won't do because that's a big industry. But what are we doing here? I mean, in America, it's a huge market for all kinds of drugs. And then Mexico gets the cash and the guns.
Right.
Right, and we have to deal with it.
Yep.
With this money from America, right? So that's why we're so, this week we have a big group of intellectuals publish an opinion paper saying we should stop prohibition because it leads to nowhere. It's a huge effort on the part of the government that should be providing security, physical security, and now they're chasing these drug lords. By the way, you take one down and then 100 come up and then they continue.
Yeah.
So, some of these issues you're also looking at in Africa, right? And talk to us about the products. Is it banking that you're seeing, straight consumer lending that you're seeing demand, and which countries in Africa?
Well, to start with, this is obviously a moment where you can't talk about issues of security in the African context without talking about the appalling events at the Westgate Mall in Nairobi, which was a really tragic situation. And I do think it's a reminder of when states truly fail, and Somalia is a good example, it doesn't just cause difficulties, horrible difficulties for the people who are living there, but it has a broader contagion effect for the whole neighborhood, and Kenya has suffered from that in a terrible way. The opportunities for us in Africa are multiple. People talk about the natural resource story, and obviously with businesses in the rest of Asia, we do a lot of business around natural resources, but it's also increasingly a story of a growing middle class in many countries in Africa. The demographics of Africa are quite extraordinary. Africa will be the single largest source of working age young people over the next 20 years. And that's either going to be a fantastic opportunity if they're given the skills, the basic infrastructure to enable them to lead productive lives, or it's going to be a huge challenge if they're put in a position where, frankly, they have nothing to do. And so I think we're excited about it. I'm fundamentally positive about the opportunity, but I also think there is a massive challenge for African countries to make their demographics into an opportunity as opposed to a problem.
I love this conversation about young people, and I'm going to hit you in a moment, Ricardo, because you are an entrepreneur yourself. I want to ask you about the difficulties getting there. But before we go there, we've talked resources and banking and certainly energy under the umbrella of resources. Let's talk healthcare for a moment. Because healthcare in this country, I believe the marriage of healthcare and technology is just enabling so much and will be one of the great growth stories of the world, and it's right here in the U.S. Talk to us, Eric, about some of the devices, the sensors that are being used right now to get ahead of disease, as we all know that we're living longer.
So, you know, the majority of the contribution to lifespan and sort of population growth has been, in fact, the increase in lifespan, not the birth rate in the last 100 years. So we have a great story here. People are living older, and of course, they're going to need all of these services. The next generation of stuff will start with your phone, and you'll have devices, transdermal patches, and other things, which will actually be monitoring your body, right? You'll choose this. It'll talk to your phone. The phone will call the doctor will call you and say, get here right now. New notion of house calls.
I love it.
And
I love it.
Think about the benefit of this. In my case, how's my mom doing? Right, my mom would be happy to do this, and I could sort of figure out, is she healthy today? Is she still doing well?
And she doesn't want to stay in the hospital. She wants to monitor herself from her home.
So the revolution, we talk a lot about health IT and the existing healthcare systems, especially here in the U.S., which of course is overpriced with the same outcomes as the other kind of systems. But the real revolution is the consumer side, the diagnostic side, the healthcare side, the maintenance side. And obviously, if you can prevent these diseases and get them early, it's a huge difference. The other thing that's happening is with the development of the human genome, discover the human genome and the details, we can now build databases and essentially do genetic sequencing of diseases, anything involving biological agents. So an example would be that the price of doing these DNA sequences has been falling faster than Moore's Law. Moore's Law is the thing that drives my industry. So it will generate, whenever that happens, it generates a huge new industry. And so if I were going to make a suggestion, the old joke was go into plastics. The new joke is go into healthcare.
I'm going to ask you what you all would do if you had to start again at the end of our panel. Go ahead, Ricardo. You want to just jump in here.
Well, I mean, I agree fully with Eric. The connectivity for me is the word. And broadband, high-speed connectivity is one situation. I don't think talking on the phone is really a good example of that. Because people hardly even speak on the phone anymore. We text each other. So maybe that doctor will text you back with do this or do the other.
He'll text you and you'll ignore it, and then you'll be in big trouble.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. I see voice going down the tube. I mean,
So it's all digital. It's all text type.
so yeah, everything's going to be digital, and the reason I'm speaking about this is it opens up this question about the digital divide. The rest of the world, or the parts of the world that are not connected with high-speed broadband, are going to fall way behind. So that's a huge political issue. We're working on that in our country. We have telecom reform, and I'm in that sector. It's been very tough. But I'm still optimistic about that. And I really believe that the way to go is fiber to the home and broadband mobility.
How does
That's
this
the recipe.
digital
Now, let's get it done.
revolution impact TV Azteca, the second largest broadcast
yeah,
that you own in
TV
Mexico?
Azteca is one of my favorite companies. We founded that just 20 years into the business. We bought it from the government. And 20 years ago, it was very different. Broadcasting was in its heyday, When I got into this business in Mexico, we had one newscast, and it was on at 10 p.m. So we wanted to find out about what was going on in Mexico. You tune into one program.
Right.
So we ignored it number 2. And now, of course, things 20 years later, information comes out your ears. I mean, you see it on the screen and then on cable. So broadcasting is in deep problems.
So you have to have.
You're saying this
is
to
my
a
own
TV.
biased
However,
question, by the way.
we are also on the production side. Yeah. So because we have integrated production, that production of content is going to go way over. It's going to grow enormously because there's no limit to content consumption, especially when you have connected environments. But just people are just want to watch it different. Linear TV packages is not what people want. They want to see compelling programs.
What other industries are getting affected negatively as well by this digital revolution?
Banking.
One of the
Banking.
One of the things you see in throughout industries is when the internet comes into it and hits the industry, profits go out of the industry. It's great for the consumer.
Which industry are you talking about?
All kinds of industries.
Eric's smiling.
The usage of the internet takes a lot of profits out, and that accrues the benefits of the consumer. The transparency, the pricing, the choice, everything goes up dramatically. So it's that should be making the economy a lot more efficient, but there are winners and losers in that.
I think particularly if you're in an industry when you're an intermediary, what happens with digital is you really have to add value because the pure intermediation margin just gets ripped out of it. And I think in banking, we still have a long way to go on this. I think partly because we've been distracted by the global financial crisis, partly because of the constraints on innovation that you get in a highly regulated industry. Mm-hmm. It's perhaps been slower in banking than it has been elsewhere. But I think we are going to see really quite profound changes in the way technology is used in banking. And it'll affect every aspect. It'll affect the way we reach customers. We're already doing tons of stuff on mobile phones and iPads and all that sort of stuff. It'll affect the very nature of the products, which I think will become increasingly configured as services rather than as products. It'll affect the way we use data. The whole big data revolution, I think we're only beginning to scratch the surface of the vast amounts of data that we have as banks and the way we use that information.
So how will banking look different then in the next 10 years?
Well, I think it'll be cheaper. It'll have more power to customers, both individuals and companies. I think there will be a sharp differentiation between winners and losers because I think banks are in very different stage in their ability to sort of see through and take advantage of technology. I also think the boundaries between some of the things that we think of as banking and other services will get rewritten.
No credit cards, no checks.
No credit cards.
All be mobile.
Well, it's all about the payment system. You see, in America, they have a especially retrograde system being called checks. I mean, this is
Right.
really 18th century.
Well, who in the room writes checks still? I do. But
lot.
this is a minority. This is amazing to me.
But it's really retrograde. You know? The cost of processing a check is horrific.
Most
So
parts
now-
of the world have given up checks a long time ago.
Yeah. Now what we've done is to handle the few foreign. We take a picture of the check and just process the.
But in Mexico, it's a security risk to have a check.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good point. It's actually helping on the security side of
It's
things.
just a problem is you can always renew
Good
on
spur to innovation.
But it is quite extraordinary how technology is just changing every industry. Are there other areas of the economy that you think will be at a detriment or sort of forced to change as a result of what's happening?
I think there's a question, actually. The interplay of globalization and technology is causing the world to be a global labor pool instead of national labor pools.
Another positive from Mexico, by the way.
Well, maybe, but when labor pools globalize, you have the traditionally wealthy countries that are high payers having now to compete increasingly with the less wealthy companies that are low payers, and they benefit, but the wealthy countries don't. And I don't think it's totally coincidental that the median income in the United States, which was 46 million in today's 46,000 in today's dollars 40 years ago, it's 51 today. 40 years of productivity increases, it's gone from 46,000 to 51,000.
Wow.
That's striking, and it's part of the problems we have in America with the, yes, it is a knowledge-based economy, and the people with the knowledge and the access can be big winners, but an awful lot of the normal people are losers because of this globalization, the march of technology, and the equalization of labor pools.
And one thing, I don't think as a country it's a good idea to position yourself as a low-cost labor producer, because there's always one who's going to undersell you.
Yeah.
So we obviously in Mexico we need to look for other things like logistics and value-added services, and of course our number one product, which is tourism. You know, Mexico had like 15 million tourists last year, and I was checking, France had 85 million.
Wow.
Spain had 45 million. I mean, we got some pretty good things in
There's some
Mexico to
headroom to
visit.
go.
No?
Yeah. Why is that? Why is that? People are afraid, or?
Well, of course. I mean, look, we had this horrific news about this virus that would kill you on contact. No?
Right.
Who wants to go there?
Yeah.
Turned out it was a
Vacation
false
spot.
alarm, by the way.
But just building on Tony's point about the interaction between the digital revolution and globalization, our sort of well-established model and mindset about globalization focuses on traded goods, things that you make in one place and then sell to another place. I think that one of the things that the internet brings is, more than any other factor, it's beginning to allow the globalization of services, so that you can actually do something for somebody living somewhere else in the world just purely through the internet. And that's most of modern economies are services. And so if they're getting globalized, that's a completely new dimension of the way the sort of global interaction between people is going to work.
Yeah.
But you got to be connected.
You go,
Gotta be
and if you're
connected,
not
sure.
connected,
Yeah,
you're...
the term for this is the hollowing out of the middle class. And what happens is that jobs which were relatively highly paying that could be automated or globalized are going to the lower cost areas, right? This is the classic, the radiologist is in India and is reading my radiology report. And there are many, many examples of that. So you end up with a bifurcated outcome where you have low-wage service workers, right, or much higher paid knowledge workers. That middle is a real crisis in the developed world, and certainly in America. And the way you solve this with education, entrepreneurship, change of the labor markets, more immigration, all the things we've been talking about.
Why haven't we done that? It seems obvious it's education. What needs to be done?
The reason it doesn't happen in governments is because the incumbencies and so forth fight change, right? We tolerate monopoly education providing, even though we know that monopolies are not a good outcome, right? We discussed this earlier. There are always special interests. And in America, the lobbyists and the amount of political contributions and so forth tend to cause, classic examples, everyone's excited about the health care bill that's just passed. It has 2,500 pages. Who wrote it? The lobbyists wrote it with the assistance of the government.
But it's a truism in a system like ours that the incumbents people, the people that have something, fight a lot harder to keep it than anyone who doesn't have things
But
fight to get it. And we have a system that's extremely fragmented. So we have checks and balances. And what that means is, you know, the small minorities can be the be the checks. And
so who speaks for
that's different from other kinds of systems.
Who speaks for the innovation that hasn't occurred yet when we write the law by the incumbents? There's no one there at the table.
Of course.
So you have to establish the philosophy that you need to leave room, right, for these new ideas and so forth. And that's a pervasive problem in governments.
It's a great way to put it. Let me ask you as we wrap up here, if you had to start your career again, would you follow the same journey? Would you do something different? Where would you like to begin again if you had the opportunity, Peter?
I don't think you could really argue rationally that trying to become a banker was the sort of perfect option.
Right, right. I understand. Yep. So
No, it would be easy to come up with lots of politically correct answers around things that I should have done. The reality is I probably would have preferred to have been a rock star. The fact that I can't sing has always been an impediment, but it might have been fun.
I'm zeroing in on the growth. We're the pulse of the global economy. So
But culture, actually, there's a serious point here. One of the things I think is fascinating about the digital revolution and culture is that cultural goods and cultural stars are being globalized at an extraordinary rate. I mean, the whole Gangnam Style phenomenon thing is a really good example of the way the dynamics work. And also, what's interesting also is it is creating a winner takes all. So the person who's a pretty mediocre rock star, but because of the limitations of communications technology, had a sort of captive market, now gets blown away by the people who are really talented in the world. So I don't think my future as a rock star is that promising.
But you would not be a banker. That was the headline there. Ricardo, you are
actually, I like banking a lot. You know? I think it has a great future. Just we have to go back to the basics. Banking was about taking deposits, safekeeping them, and then channeling into loans that are productive and useful for the communities. And I think that's where the international banking system sort of lost track, on the loan side of the equation. So we got to go back to making these productive loans, and I think that's a great challenge, especially when we see people using this, like I said, the women example, or the small entrepreneurs that need maybe $500.
How tough was it?
I mean, we were always accused of being rather boring as a bank, and we're quite proud of being boring as a bank because we focused on that kind of stuff.
How tough was it when you were starting out as an entrepreneur in terms of getting the resources that you needed?
It was very tough, and many people think that we were born rich and successful. No. I was born poor and miserable, not exactly, but we didn't have anything. So we had 50 stores 35 years ago, and we had 1,500 employees. So now today we have 5,000 stores, we had 95,000 employees. We've switched off from retailing, went into banking and telecom and broadcasting and the international area. So all of that I've been able to do with a good team, but it's a complete una lucha. I have to struggle every day.
You're married to it.
No, I have to struggle every day to overcome the basic opposition, which is all the government regulations that we have to jump over.
Yep.
So that's my one pet peeve.
Tony, what would you do?
In my career, I've always chosen sort of younger, growth-oriented situations or broken situations, but small, where I thought I could play a significant role in growing them and making them better. And that's worked out really well for me, and it's been fantastic. I'd say if I had to do something again, I'd say once they got to be big and successful, I'd leave them earlier and go start over again.
Huh, that's good. Eric, what about you?
It's great to have an opportunity to be part of building a future. When you go through what's happening now, we talked about energy, we talked about telecommunications, think about the knowledge, think about all the artificial intelligence and the ways in which we can help people. Think about what we can do for medicine to really improve people's lives. I would always want to be doing one of those.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Good.